What's up, Teeny? Huh? Yeah? Okay, how are my levels here? I think that should be fine. Welcome to the video. We're getting ready here. So, ironically, despite the fact that we're going to be talking quite a bit about structure in this video, the video itself is not going to be heavily structured, at least in terms of me recording this. I want to cover a few different things, and I have no idea how long it'll take me to get from one point to the other, so I'll try to be clear in the video presentation, maybe even chapters and stuff. If you want to skip ahead to a certain section, go for it. This is a little bit more loose. I would call it one of the Brainstorm videos, sort of, because it's kind of just free-form association stuff, exploring a certain topic. But the topic that I really want to look into today is a very important distinction between form and content in media. Now, right off the bat, I need to make it clear the way in which I'm using these specific terms, because there's a precedent for these terms in discussion on media criticism, media theory specifically. Kandinsky, in fact, has an essay entitled Form and Content, or Content and Form, I forget the order, but anyway, pretty famous essay, and Kandinsky's view of, or rather, his definition of each of these terms is slightly different from the definitions that I'm going to be using here. Also, he was mostly applying those definitions to visual art, specifically painting and sculpture, things like that. I am more or less going to be focusing this terminology on storytelling, on narrative. So please keep that in mind. Also, I mean, obviously here on the internet, content has taken on a very particular definition. It's basically synonymous with internet media of some kind, media original to the internet. The normalization of that term is a whole other topic, but the way that I'm using content here is not that definition of content. I want to make that clear. Okay, so what am I actually referring to with form and content? Form is the structure, or sort of the support elements of a piece of media, a piece of storytelling, and then the content is the surface level elements within that piece of media. Just to give a really quick example, and of course a lot of this is up for discussion and debate, so you can disagree, just so we're all on the same page. Here is how I would break down specific elements of, let's say, a movie or a TV show into the categories of form and content. Over in form, we have just a lot of structural elements, like the 3-act structure, for example, the hero's journey master plot, which we'll be talking about master plots in a little more detail later on, or even just like runtime limitations, right? Like a feature film runtime, whether that's 90 minutes or 2 hours, I would call that an element of form rather than an element of content, or just, a genre. I think I would put a genre in form rather than content. Meanwhile, on the side of content, you have characters, motivations of your characters, themes of the work, some, dialogue, settings, visuals, etc. The surface level elements that you can notice right away. Another way that I guess I could try to describe the separation between form and content is like, okay, we have a glass. Let's even just say like a glass of wine. The form is the glass itself, and the content is the wine. Together they combine to create this experience, right? You're drinking a glass of wine. It really wouldn't be possible without some kind of glass or like the bottle itself, but there is a very clear distinction between the container and the stuff contained within the container. But one of the biggest reasons why I want to bring up this incredibly important distinction between form and content is because in discussion about media, when we talk about, media online, especially here on YouTube, or even just right here on my channel, in the past, I think I've kind of failed to distinguish the differences between criticizing form and criticizing content. And criticism of one of these aspects isn't necessarily criticism of all the other stuff. So the go-to example here, and in fact, one of the reasons that I wanted to make this video at all is because of some of the discussion that sprang up after I posted my video on Beowulf. I made a quick video about the Beowulf movie. I didn't think it was all that great, but specifically, I really focused on this element of the movie itself where it was really concerned with like the death of the hero and the importance of heroes to human culture and storytelling, I guess, and I really disagreed with that. I don't think that hero narratives are essential really to human culture, at least these days. I in fact think that there's often an overemphasis on hero characters in a lot of contemporary storytelling. I tied hero narratives very closely with the hero's journey structure itself. This is an ancient story structure. It also qualifies as a master plot, technically. If you're into narrative theory, narratology stuff, you're probably familiar with Joseph Campbell's work, academic type. He researched storytelling traditions, and specifically, he basically said this hero's journey structure has been around across all cultures for thousands of years, and that's why it still works today, is that it speaks to something innate to the human experience, and a lot of people today still subscribe to that idea that the hero's journey is just, oh, this is like basically the best storytelling format, the best storytelling structure that we can use, so let's just keep using that forever. I disagree with that perspective more or less completely, and so some of the discussion that came up after I posted that Beowulf video was other people, I think it was in one of the streams, and we were talking about, oh, hero's journey stuff, Beowulf specifically, hero narratives, and the other folks in the chat seemed to agree with me that like it gets old, it is old in a literal way, but it also just starts to feel very stale when you start to notice the patterns of this specific story structure, and as a result it can make whatever media that uses that structure a little bit less interesting. That's certainly how I feel about it. Some other people seemed to resonate with those ideas. We also talked about how there's certainly a tendency in the Western canon for hero's journey narratives to feature a hero who is white, male, and typically very young. Like that is the hero archetype that we've had in some of the most famous and widely disseminated stories in the Western canon ever. And here is a really wonderful opportunity to explore the relationship between form and content. So like I said earlier, these are separate components of a piece of media, but at the same time, specific elements that fall within either category can be very closely related, and they can potentially also influence each other. For example, what we were just talking about there with hero's journey narratives, the hero's journey structure on its own does not dictate at all that the lead character, that the hero, needs to be some young white guy. That's not part of it. It's just a structure. It doesn't dictate what the character needs to be. It kind of dictates their motivations, which I think fall on the side of content, but it's not a one-to-one connection with the creation of the character. Character falls on the side of content. It's up to the artist to come up with a character. If the artist is looking back at hundreds or thousands of years of hero journey narratives and they just say, oh, well, it's always been a young white guy, I'm not going to question that norm. I'll just do one of those. Okay, in that case, I feel like the hero's journey structure, that element of form, has had a direct impact on that element of content, even though it ultimately comes down to the decision of the person creating the piece of media. We could also argue that, like, okay, I put genre. I said that genre is an element of form rather than content, but I definitely think that genre can very often have a heavy influence on many different aspects of content, from characters to settings, especially dialogue. So for example, okay, we're talking about a sci-fi story. We're talking about the sci-fi genre. Chances are characters in a sci-fi thing are potentially going to have dialogue that feels different from our own. Chances are they're going to be somewhere in space on a different planet that's not our own. There is a strong relationship there between genre and all these elements of content, but it's not a 100% guarantee. You could technically do sci-fi that's set on planet Earth in the modern day with characters just speaking like we do, but there are these norms. There are these norms, and the structure can potentially influence many different elements of content. I want to make that point very clear. Another reason why I wanted to bring up this topic is because not just in my video on Beowulf, but in plenty of my videos and sort of my reviews or just impressions videos of different shows and movies and such, I feel like I pretty often criticize structure. I might also have criticisms of specific elements of content, but very often I find myself criticizing structure because if I recognize a story structure that is so overly familiar to me, and I feel like the content is adhering to that structure so closely that I'm not actually getting something new, I'm not usually having a good time with that piece of media. That said, you can totally have a very familiar structure, a very familiar form, but do some incredible things with the content. And this is where I also need to say that, like, as much as I think that it's time for human beings to kind of maybe move on from the hero's journey structure a little bit, or in fact, who knows, maybe even move on from all the master plots that we've uncovered, that doesn't mean that they're completely useless. That doesn't mean that even the hero's journey specifically is not worth having, because as we just discussed, form and content, the relationship isn't 100%. Any individual artist can choose to do different things with a very old structure, and that's definitely the case with the hero's journey. Just because a work uses a particular structure that I'm kind of sick of at this point, that doesn't mean that the whole thing is going to be bad. That doesn't mean that it's not a guarantee that I'm not going to enjoy the work. It's just one factor in the equation. Just having a familiar structure is not a deal breaker for me at all. There are no limits to creativity, and while a familiar form, a familiar structure might limit certain aspects of a work, you can still do really, really interesting things with it. Now, that said, I think that if you're aiming to be incredibly creative, if you're trying to do something that feels really new, then it's in your best interest to look for a structure that's not super familiar, because automatically you're cutting those ties with potential influences from what some might feel are outmoded or narrative structures. You're free to do more or less whatever you want once you step outside of those conventions. I guess I should briefly touch on master plots, because I've mentioned that a few different times, and the hero's journey itself is technically a master plot, but here's a list of master plots. This is just a list of master plots that some guy came up with. I'll put his name here. He's an academic guy, he's an author. He identified these a while back in a book, and a lot of people since then have really agreed with this list of master plots. And if you go down this list and look at a description of each one of these master plots, you can probably think of plenty of movies, shows, or even just stories you tell in your daily life that fit into one of these structures. And something else that's very important to understand about master plots is that they tend to have incredibly strong connections to dominant cultural ideas. This is something that I talked about briefly before. So many of the big budget, major studio movies that we see, I just think this is an easy example. It applies to other types of media as well. But in these giant big budget movies, you can almost always tie back the messaging of the movie to a dominant cultural idea. Most likely a dominant cultural idea present in sort of the target country or countries. So for example, here in the US, we really love this cultural concept of merit-based success, this basic form of the American dream that it doesn't matter who you are, what your identity is, as long as you work hard enough and you deliver something of value to society, you will be rewarded for it, you can become successful, you can make a better life for yourself and your family, etc. And because we still believe in this idea so strongly, despite the fact that it's not actually true, we have tons and tons of movies that, if we look back to the list of master plots, would be qualified as underdog stories. The underdog is going to win, and because they start out in a position that is more or less absent of power, it makes them more sympathetic. It makes their rise to power and success more dramatically satisfying, right? Some of this might be on purpose. The insertion and adherence to master plots might be on purpose in terms of like a marketing perspective, right? Because ultimately a lot of these massive budget movies are investments. They're financial investments, not necessarily pieces of art. And to reduce risk, you can impose one of these master plots onto the movie. And if it happens to adhere, if it happens to line up with a cultural idea that most people agree with, it'll probably perform better. I mean, there are tons of other variables at play, but you're gonna have a better chance of succeeding as opposed to putting messaging into your movie that does not support dominant cultural ideas. So for example, okay, a movie like King Richard, which I think very much supports this dominant cultural idea of merit-based success. It's an underdog story. If you flipped that, and if you made a story about someone down on their luck without power, continuing to not have power, despite the fact that that probably lines up with reality much more often, I don't think audiences would be super into it. I think you'd probably get some pushback. It would probably be relegated to like the art house corner where you're not going to make a bunch of money, anything like that. Big giant movies, you can almost always rely on them to have one of these master plots. And not only that, but like marketing professionals have known for decades that utilizing these master plots, telling stories that people already agree with in their subconscious, probably from repeated messaging in the past, is probably going to get you better results. I'd love to analyze some advertisements in the near future to sort of show this in action. But for the moment, I do think that oftentimes these are conscious choices to apply master plots to pieces of media, whatever they happen to be. And at other times, I'm sure they could also be subconscious choices. All of us have these cultural ideas ingrained in us already, just from being a member of whatever culture we already belong to. And so those could, if you happen to write a script, you might find yourself naturally pointing it in the direction of one of these master plots, in one of these, in my opinion, generally outdated structures that have an undue amount of influence over the content, which can potentially result in a finished product that feels very much like plenty of other stuff that we've seen before. And this is where I'll try to wrap everything up by elaborating on why this is such a big deal to me personally, and as someone who talks about media on the internet and who sometimes struggles to make it very clear exactly how I feel about different elements of a piece of media. I very rarely see other people who discuss media online, specifically in terms of movies and television. I almost never hear critique of structure. It's almost always critique and discussion of content. Well, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that we could stand to discuss form a whole lot more, like much more. In fact, the only instances I can think of where big internet media critics discuss structure at all is when they say that it doesn't have the normal movie structure, the normal television structure that has been proven to work, and therefore that's to the detriment of the media. And that's not necessarily something that I agree with. You don't necessarily need these typical structures to do something that I would consider to be good, that I would consider to be successful as an emotionally impactful piece of art. But outside of my own feelings on criticizing structure, which I think we need to do a lot more, and which I will continue to do in discussions on different pieces of media, I also think that for people out there who happen to be watching this and who want to get more involved in like media criticism or media theory, or want to understand media on a whole new level, I think that the ability to identify form specifically, rather than just elements of content, can be extremely useful to their understanding of larger concepts in media and also cultural messaging, almost leaning over into the area of anthropology. But it starts there. It starts with the ability to recognize the patterns, to recognize the form, the structure of work that's repeated across different mediums, across different projects, shows, franchises, etc. It can really open your mind up to understanding this media in a whole new way. And I think that's exciting. That's been very exciting for me in the past. It's a process that's ongoing for me. But yeah, I think a lot of it starts with separating form and content, and then identifying aspects of form that keep coming up over and over, and then asking ourselves, why? Why do those keep showing up? What function are they serving? Was this a conscious choice on the part of the team behind the project? Was this a subconscious thing, the result of years of ingrained cultural messaging? It's just fascinating to me. It's really interesting to think about. And this is the foundation of that, understanding the difference between form and content. So I hope I've done some kind of a half-decent job of explaining my thoughts on the whole thing. This is definitely one of those videos where I really hope to discuss this with people in the future. Who knows whether or not I'll read the comments. I've kind of stayed away from those for a while, but certainly in streams and stuff, if you want to talk about this kind of thing, more than welcome. I think it would be a great time. But for now, I'm gonna take a drink of water because I've been talking for a long time, and I'll just say thanks for stopping by.